Most candidates get stuck when answering sticky questions in a job search. These are the hard to answer questions, things like gaps in your resume, being fired, job hopping, or not having experience in a particular industry. It's all structural stuff that's hard to get past, but the reality is you can turn these sticky interview questions into moments and stories of strength. Let me teach you how. Let's get into it. We're going to talk about using the DARE framework. I've put together the DARE framework to help people answer sticky interview questions. It's not the DARE framework that some of you might remember from our elementary school days, but instead, this DARE framework is going to allow you to take a sticky interview question, understand it a little bit more deeply, and unravel it in a way that, again, allows you to showcase a strength. First, though, let's go over why you're asked these questions in general. Whether it's a recruiter, a hiring manager, employers in general want to ensure that potential red flags are dealt with in the process of an interview. In other words, employers have seen patterns of past behavior they want to avoid, or that one particular red flag might be an indication of a more important or serious problem with a candidacy. And so it's their job, it's their obligation in a healthy hiring process to get more details from you. The existence of these questions does not mean you won't be hired. It's not a deal breaker. It just is a reason for them to have further conversation about a particular sticky topic. And that brings me to step one of the framework. The D in this case is about creating emotional distance from the question that you're being asked. The distance will allow you to gain perspective and understanding of the question, have empathy for the other side and why they're asking it, and therefore kind of control and regulate your emotions in your response. It's super important to acknowledge, again, for yourself and maybe even in the form of your answer, the reason and the perspective as to why you're being asked the question. In other words, understand that it's diligence. It's not personal. Ask yourself why you're being asked this particular detail. As an example, if they see a lot of jumpiness in your background, there's some instability that they're worried about. There's some potential that you are the problem at every new employer you join, and they want to be assuaged. They want to be reassured that it actually isn't about potential conflict and potential issues you're going to cause at their company, but instead that you might have a good answer that helps explain it in a way that doesn't predict future problems. So again, create some emotional distance and understand it from a more abstracted perspective so that you can answer it a little less emotionally. The other thing about creating distance that I want to remind everybody is avoid sharing details that might be more gambles than certainties. In other words, sometimes when you have commentary around stories you're telling in your past experience, you might not realize that the details of the story or the emotions or the perspective of your story isn't something that will definitively come across the way you expect to the person on the other side. As an example here, let's say that you're talking to a potential future boss, a hiring manager, and you're sharing a story about a past manager. And you're saying, hey, this person didn't know what they were doing or they were toxic. Whether or not that's true, let's put that aside for a second. Remember, the other person doesn't have context around this past situation. They don't trust you yet, and they don't have enough information. And so when you complain about someone who was your prior boss, they might identify in that moment more with that other boss that you had. In other words, they share titles and responsibilities. They've had employees they've struggled with. And so when you complain in a specific or certain way, that person on the other side who's interviewing you might not resonate with your complaint. And in the back of their head, they might wonder if you were the problem. So when you're sharing these sorts of stories where you do have a strong subjective perspective, remember to consider whether that subjective perspective is something that the person is very likely to agree with, or again, might not have enough information on, and avoid taking gambles when not necessary. Okay, step 2 of the DARE framework, we're in the A. It's to draw back to an abstraction. In other words, you want to connect your individual story and experience to some broader agreed upon truth and narrative. By doing so, by having this broader context and narrative, you're essentially saying, look, this isn't necessarily about me. This is something that we can all agree happens pretty often based on XYZ factor. As an example, you might have a jumpy resume, but you might explain it by drawing to the abstraction about joining a lot of early stage startups. And you might talk about how that's been intentional in your career. You've wanted to join early stage environments. You wanted to join teams at the pre-seed and seed stage because you're excited about the 0 to 1 moment. But inherent to joining the early stage startup environment is a lot of these ventures will pivot or fail or lose funding. And so that's a recognizable pattern. We can all agree that that's happening in the early stage. And an employee who is motivated by continuously joining startups is also opening themselves up to risk that they have a jumpier resume. But again, you're going to go to the abstraction. You're going to go to the overall narrative rather than talking only about your particular story, because that's an agreed upon recognizable pattern that anyone on the other side is going to go, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's true that if you join a lot of startups, it's likely that you have a jumpier resume or shorter tenures. You haven't hit the rocket ship yet. And again, this can be company-wide layoffs. This can be about your role no longer being a fit once a new direction was taken, or maybe even a mismatch as to what you discussed with the company in an interview versus what the role actually needed once you dug into the details and joined the team. These don't need to explain away everything and every negative part of a particular story, but it helps the interviewer understand what happened and that it's not purely about you. Because again, they're just looking for a signal that this isn't a red flag about you in particular that is going to repeat itself once they hire you. In other words, the abstraction step is about showcasing that you're not individually problematic, but that you're part of a larger and understandable situation. All right, next is R, and that's for maintaining responsibility. Here is how you can showcase your own choices, involvement, good or bad in a situation. And this is important because this is where you're going to do all this other explaining and abstraction drawing, and you want to make sure that you still sound accountable and you still sound like you're responsible for your own actions or your own behavior inside any particular scenario. This is where you're going to use I language. You're going to take ownership for the decisions that you took, even if you're in a larger context and things are happening to you in the abstraction. There's still a portion of you that is driving some of the choices or pulling certain levers. Let's take that startup example. If you've joined multiple early stage startups and they haven't gone well, but you say, hey, I've chosen this path because I like 0 to 1 moments. I find myself most motivated whether in a small team, if we're in early stage context, if we're building something brand new. And this is going to feel authentic. It's a way to passively say, without being too cringy, hey, I'm doing this on purpose. And yes, it's created this jumpy resume, but it's intentional. And a really easy thing to do in these moments is to also name the counterfactual. What could you have done instead? Because that'll make it clear that you understand there was another choice that you didn't take. And again, that's all about taking accountability. And so you might say, look, I could have joined a bigger company. I could have gone for more stability. But in my career, again, I've just favored these companies instead that offer me a lot more ownership and a lot more ability to craft something brand new in the world. You're going to come across as self-aware and proactive. Even in a story where a lot of things might be happening to you and you don't have a lot of levers of control, you'll still seem like an active participant, and every employer wants that. All right, let's wrap up the DARE framework. We're in the E, and this means ending with education. In other words, wrap up by showcasing a little bit of growth in you as a person, self-awareness, and how whatever situation happened informs your future, informs your approach, has changed how you approach future situations or will change how you approach future situations. In other words, what might you do differently next time? Or what are you sticking to, but for reasons that you can kind of educate about? So in other words, you might highlight lessons learned, but you might still say, I want to kind of pattern the same way that I have in the past. Let's use the startup example. You can say, look, I have learned a lot about how to judge an early stage startup from afar and try to make more certain bets about a company that I think is going to go 2 to 4 years at least into the future and has a likelier chance to receive future funding or launch their product and have revenue and just be more sustainable and, again, make bets on companies that are likely to last. But at the same time, you haven't lost your drive for that 0 to 1 moment. That's why you're excited to bring all the skills you have been accumulating and all these experiences to whatever company you might be talking to in that conversation. In other words, you can tie the story that you're telling and say, look, actually, and that's why I'm in this chat with you. That's why I applied to yet another startup. You won't always be able to do that tie together, but if you can, it can really emphasize why you're a fit for a particular company. But in other cases, this just might be about you clarifying how some things change your approach moving forward. Let's take the example of you mismatching with a job. And you've just talked through that experience. You've done the abstraction. You've maintained responsibility. And now you can say, look, one of the things I've changed is during the interview process, I'm a lot clearer in trying to understand what someone's looking for in a particular role. Because marketing or operations or product, those can feel very different company to company. And you've realized that there are a set of questions that you use to make sure that you're on the same page, that you as a marketer, you as a product person fit what a company is looking for in that role in particular. So again, let's just use an example to wrap things up here. Someone might ask you, hey, why'd you leave your last role? Maybe even they realize you had told them you were let go. Why were you let go from your last position? First, create that distance. First, recognize and have empathy for the fact they're asking this question because they want to make sure there's no big red flag that's just going to repeat itself in the first 30 days. Once you realize that, you're going to be able to do the next 3 steps really excellently. Next, draw to the abstraction. Maybe you're a marketer. And what you're going to say is, look, marketing is so different role to role. Even in the same context, let's say a B2B SaaS company selling a fintech solution. A marketer at the Series A is going to do a very different set of activities than, let's say, a marketer at the Series D. And you're going to say, look, the expectations just didn't line up. What we talked about in the interview process and what I thought would be the challenge wasn't what wound up being the challenge when I got into the role. The executive team was looking for something different, or there were a different set of objectives. And by drawing to this abstraction, again, you're setting yourself up to say, hey, there's some agreed upon truth. This is how things can go wrong. It went wrong, normal, not unique to me. This is where you then go into the responsibility, maintaining responsibility. And you're going to say something like, look, in that moment, I could have asked deeper questions in the interview process. I maybe even could have done that job for a little bit longer than I did and put a little bit of different effort forward. I just really didn't think I was a fit. I wasn't enjoying the role as is. It wasn't taking advantage of the skills that I think I bring to the table. And all of that I language is going to showcase that you understand you could have taken a different set of paths or pulled different levers to maybe make something work. You didn't, but again, you understand you could have. That self-awareness is key. And then you end with that education. You say, look, I do a lot more work in understanding and researching a company, but then also asking the right questions inside of an interview process to make sure it's not just a title to title match, but also context to context match. Ending with that education, if you can even tie it to why you're in that conversation in particular. And you can say, look, and that's why I'm really excited about the interview we're in now, because I know you guys are at XYZ stage where my skill set ZYX is going to be key. And I think it could be a really great fit. And what you're hopefully getting out of using this DARE framework is you're going to get somebody on the other side who's nodding their head and going, yeah, I can see why all of this happened. It all makes sense to me, and I appreciate their honesty. You've prevented yourself from getting too emotional. You've drawn to an abstraction that allows you to storytell about broader patterns and themes rather than being too particular about your personal story. You've still maintained responsibility and accountability, which showcases that self-awareness and ability to have agency in a situation. You've ended with an education, which showcases you're a learner along the way. Every experience builds a better version of yourself. Turn these tough questions, these sticky questions, these tough spots into opportunities to prove your adaptability, your awareness, and your growth mindset. All of these are qualities that hiring managers and companies love nowadays. If you found this helpful, subscribe to the channel. A lot more where this came from. If you've got questions and you're in a job search right now, or you might be in the next 6 months, leave them in the comments below. I'll hit them up every couple days. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.